Now let's look into the difference between imperative and declarative orchestration. Before getting to the practical steps of the Kubernetes deployment and Kubernetes objects and Kubernetes mega projects, it is important to understand the key approaches to orchestration. So the first one is imperative approach. The classic imperative approach for managing software involves several steps or tasks, some of which are manual. When working in a team, it is usually required that these steps be documented and in an ideal case automated. So preparing good documentation for a classic imperative administrative procedure and automating these steps can be non-trivial tasks even if each of the step is simple. And second approach that we have here is a declarative approach. A declarative approach for administrative tasks is intended to solve such challenges. With a declarative approach, an administrator defines a target state for a system, example application, server, or cluster. So typically, a domain specific language DSL is used to describe the target state. And administrative tools such as Kubernetes takes this definition as an input and takes care of how to achieve the target state from the current observable state. So Kubernetes object management using imperative and declarative. The kubectl command line tool supports several different ways to create and manage Kubernetes objects. So this slide provides an overview of the different approaches. So management techniques, imperative commands, it operates on live objects and a recommended environment is just development projects and practicing. For practicing, it would be helpful. And imperative object configuration, this is operates on individual files and it can be used in production projects also. Then we have the third one, which is declarative object configuration. So it declarative object configuration can be operated on directories of files. So production projects also this will be widely used, and a recommended environment for this technique is production projects. So imperative commands. What are the imperative commands? What does an imperative command means? When using imperative commands, a user operates directly on live objects in a cluster. What is an object? That we are going to discuss in a while, but don't worry. So in a simplest way, let's consider an object means a state, a node. In this case we are going to consider as a pod is one object, a pod. Okay, pod is one object. So when using imperative commands, a user operates directly on live objects in a cluster. That means a live pods on a cluster. The user provides operations to the kubectl command as an argument or flags. This is the recommended way to get started or to run a one-off task in a cluster, because this technique operates directly on live objects. It provides no history of previous configurations. For example, if you want to run an instance of nginx container, for that we have to create a deployment object. If you want to run an instance of nginx container, you have to create a deployment object. So this deployment object, because there are different types of objects are available in Kubernetes. A pod is one object, deployment is one object, service is one object, secret is one object, and config map is one object, job is one object. So however, we are going to look, we are going to see each and every object in Kubernetes, and we are going to do practical demonstration of how can we work on this each and every object. So all these things we are going to see, but for now we will consider one example. One is, now we want to run an instance of nginx container in a pod. So if you want to run an nginx container, so obviously you need to go for a deployment object. So we have to create a deployment definition file, and then when we say create this deployment object, then the required thing will be happening. For that, the command is will be kubectl create and deployment nginx, and image name is nginx, deployment name is nginx. Here image option and nginx is the name, it's gonna fetch it, whereas the deployment name we have given is nginx. And for this we need to have this is as an imperative command, so we don't need to have a file. If you, okay, now we are looking at the imperative command, so we don't require a file, we'll just type the command itself. Okay, so next, imperative object configuration. In imperative object configuration, the kubectl command specifies the operations such as create, replace, etc. Optional flags and at least one file name uh, can also be used. So the file specified must contain a full definition of the object in YAML or JSON format. That's what I was talking about. So basically, an imperative object configuration, the difference between an imperative command and an imperative object configuration is pretty simple. For imperative command, you just type the command and you execute. For this, you say to create, to run an instance of nginx container, what we are going to do is, when imperative command is to give a command, that's it, kubectl create deployment, name of the deployment is nginx, and image from which you want to run a container is nginx, that's it. Whereas imperative object configuration, we are going to write a definition file. It's a simple file, YAML file, but normally in Kubernetes language we call it as a definition files. So we will write a definition files. In that definition file we will mention each and every property of that deployment object, and once it is run, then once it is done, then you can create deployment object from that. So example, again we have taken the same, create the nginx, run an instance of the nginx container. So for that it's pretty simple, we'll say kubectl create remain same, option F, and then you have to give the definition file, that is nginx.yaml. This is our definition file to create uh, either you can call it as a definition file, or sometimes they call it as a configuration file. However it may be, it's gonna create a respective deployment object. So delete, if you want to delete the objects defined in the configuration file, so if you have two configuration files, still you can delete it easily. So again you have to use that configuration file only, even if you want to delete it. So for to delete that, you have to mention kubectl delete Option F, nginx aml, that is one configuration file or definition file, and redis.aml file, this is another configuration file or um, definition file. So the imperative replaces the imperative replace command replaces the existing spec with the newly provided one, dropping all changes to the object missing from the configuration file. So this approach should not be used with the resource types whose specs are updated independently of the configuration file. Services of type load balancer, for example, have their external IPs field updated independently from the configuration by the cluster. So examples, uh, like create the objects defined in the configuration file of nginx.aml or redis.aml. So then we have the third type, which is declarative object configuration. So here, when using declarative object configuration, a user operates on object configuration files stored locally. However, the user does not define the operations to be taken on the files. Create, update, and delete operations are automatically detected per object by kubectl. So this enables working on directory where different operations might be needed for different objects. So note that declarative object configuration retains changes made by other writers even if the changes are not merged back to the object configuration file. So this is possible by using the patch API operation to write only observed differences instead of using the replace API operations to replace the entire object configuration. So now let's look into some of the examples. So to process all object configuration files in the config directory and create or patch the live objects, you can first diff to see what changes are going to be made, and then you can apply. That's it. This is how you use a kubectl diff to to see what changes are going to be made, and then once you apply -f config, so all the files, all the definition files which are there inside this directory will be executed, and based on the instructions that are mentioned inside that aml file will be executed and will be created and will be deployed, and whatever type of object it could be, that object will be run. So that's how with one command you are able to create all objects. You are able to create all the objects. So that's why it's called declarative object configuration. So recursively process, if you want to recursively process directories, for example, in the directory subdirectory you have attached definition files of various objects. So then you can give kubectl diff option r of option f configs, and finally you say apply option r, that is recursively to process recursively to process the directories recursively, we use option R, and configs is the directory where our definition files of objects are presented. Now let's look into this imperative and declarative, the differences between imperative and declarative more. So imperative commands, so advantages compared to the object configuration. So commands are expressed as a single action word. That's the best advantage. And then commands require only a single step to make a changes to the cluster. Disadvantages, disadvantages compared to object configuration. Commands do not integrate with the change review processes. commands do not provide an adult trail associated with changes. And one more disadvantage is commands do not provide a source of records except for what is live. And commands do not provide a template for creating new objects. And imperative object configuration, the next one, the advantages of imperative object configuration compared to imperative commands are object configuration can be stored in a source control system such as Git, whereas imperative it is not possible because even it can be saved, it can be used later. So object configuration can integrate with processes such as reviewing changes before push and audit trials. So object configuration provides a template for creating new objects. Disadvantages of imperative object configuration compared to the imperative commands are following. So object configuration requires basic understanding of the object schema, and object configuration requires an additional step of writing YAML file, YAML file. Until unless you write YAML file, it is difficult to make the way of working as imperative object configuration. Then we have a declarative object configuration. So advantages of declarative object configuration compared to the object configuration, imperative object configuration. So changes made directly to live objects are retained. So even if they are not merged back into the configuration files. So the declarative object configuration has better support for operating on directories and automatically detecting operation types. It could be create, patch, delete per object. It's basically this Kubernetes is absolutely dependent on objects. Then some of the disadvantages compared to imperative object configuration are declarative object configuration is harder to debug and understand results when they are unexpected. So partial updates using defs create complex merge and patch operations.